Hello everyone, my name is Samim Mirhosseini and today I'm going to tell you about our research, Docable, on evaluating the executability of software tutorials. Have you ever tried to follow a tutorial but at the end got something that's totally different from what tutorial tried to teach you? Here's an example. The tutorial tries to teach you how to make these Cookie Monster cupcakes, but you will end up with what's shown on the right. Before we continue to the talk, let's take a look and see what we mean by these tutorials. So here we are going to show you a DigitalOcean tutorial. DigitalOcean is one of the most well-known sources for tutorials, which focuses on software administration and DevOps. They have more than 400 million views. And I want to point out that their writing guidelines mentions this. We explicitly include every command for a reader to go from their first initial SSH connection on a brand new server to the final working setup. So they want to include all the necessary steps for the new user to be able to complete this tutorial successfully. Let's see how this tutorial looks. So the tutorial starts with a section for prerequisites, which explains what you need before starting the tutorial. It shows these highlighted areas, which we will call code blocks, and these code blocks might show content of a file, a command that you need to run, or the output that you should expect from running these commands. But again, the reality and expectation are different. So a tutorial might tell you to run one command, and then when you run it, you will get this error which says your system is unable to locate these packages. And it's a common pattern that we can see here. If we check these tutorials, we will even see comments from people who try to follow these tutorials. And they say they try to follow this step and they were unable to run it successfully. So in this study, we are going to use mixed methods. So first, we are going to try to execute the tutorials, and then we will inspect the tutorials, the execution results, and try to validate them with informants who are tutorial authors and other experts. So this takes us to our first research question. Can tutorials be naively executed, and if not, why? So what we mean by naively executing a tutorial is basically copying and pasting each code block and trying to execute it. This might be similar to the approach where a novice user is reading a tutorial, and it's very similar to other studies who focused on this subject. And then, after executing the tutorial, we are going to cluster the executions based on the exit codes. For this part of the study, we collected 660 tutorials from 3 sources, so we have more diversity and not focusing on one source. These sources are DigitalOcean, Walter, and Linux size. And we created a testing harness, which will create a virtual machine for each tutorial. So then we used this testing harness to execute all of these 663 tutorials with the naive approach. Our results show that 39% of the tutorials have timed out. And as a result of that, 36% of the code blocks were completely unreachable. And only 26% of the code blocks executed successfully. So to better understand the reason for these failures, we are going to take a look at the exit codes. Here we can see one of the most common exit codes is 127, which indicates a command not found error. So the code block could be not a command, or it might be because a previous command has failed and this tool that we are trying to run in this step, it does not exist right now. The other two common exit codes are 100 and 5, which both indicate unable to locate some resources. This might be because a previous step has failed. So we saw that code blocks might not be commands, and if something fails, it might cause cascading failures. So we saw that executing tutorials might need a deeper interpretation of the code blocks. So next, we started inspecting the tutorials to better understand different types of code blocks. And we created 4 groups of code blocks. Commands that needs to be executed, and they might refer to a text editor or include a template value or open an interactive shell. File content, which might be shown partially, or it might instruct the reader to update some parts of the file based on some template values. It might instruct the reader to uncomment specific lines in the file, or it might instruct the reader to add some lines in specific locations of an existing file. And instructions output, which might be also shown partially. It might include template values that the reader needs to update. It might show responses to an interactive prompt, or it might show output from running something in another interactive shell. For example, running a MySQL query. And finally, presentation code blocks, which are not relevant to execution of a tutorial. For example, displaying a URL for the user. So we saw all these types of code blocks, and we were wondering, can we introduce some human annotations to help with these executions and hopefully improve the execution rates? So we created Docable, which is a tool for selecting different code blocks within the tutorial. As you can see, Docable annotations can point out to different sections in the tutorial based on the description text. And then we can specify things like response to a prompt or the location where a file needs to be created. So we selected a 6% stratified random sample of our dataset of tutorials, which resulted in 40 tutorials. Then we wrote dockable annotations for these tutorials and tried to execute them again. This time, the successful execution rate improved to 52%, which is substantially when we compare it to 26% in our naive approach. But the problem is, we are still unable to execute any tutorial successfully from start to finish. So next, we started inspecting these execution results from Docable to better understand what are the barriers that prevented us from executing these tutorials successfully. In summary, we found 4 types of barriers, and in this presentation, I'm going to focus on 3 of them because of time. But I would be happy to discuss the rest of them in our discussion session, or you can check out our paper. So these barriers are assumptions about reader's environment, inconsistency in content blocks, missing, contradictory, and volatile instructions, documentation rot, and inaccessible external resources. So a problem related to assumptions that the tutorial authors might make about the reader's environment. There are these prerequisite sections in all of these tutorials, which they might point out to one or more tutorials. And this can even run multiple levels deep. So each of those prerequisites might have their own prerequisites. And this can become problematic, especially when the reader doesn't know which one of these links they need to follow and whether or not these links are up to date. We also saw there is no standard convention for how the content of a block is displayed. Some tutorials try to summarize specific locations in a file using these 3 dot notations, and the other tutorials displayed the whole file but only focused on explaining some specific parts of it. For example, in this content block, they are summarizing the file using the 3 dot notations. However, the part that is highlighted in yellow should not be updated, and the part that is highlighted in green needs to be updated with a template value based on what the reader is trying to use. And then when we asked our informants about this problem, they said tutorials are designed for humans, and they claim that these ambiguities actually does help humans better understand. But the other perspective realized their expert blind spot. They said the three-dot notation is really not helping people, because the author knows what they mean by this, but the reader might not know what they are looking for. We also noticed that some tutorials try to use some resources which might not be available for the reader. For example, a domain name or online services from DigitalOcean or Walter, such as a disk space, or integration with other services like GitHub and Slack. In this example, we can see the tutorial is trying to use an additional disk from one of these services, which we did not have available in our environment. And one of our informants recognized this barrier and described that at DigitalOcean, they try to minimize this problem by making tutorials so that any reader will be able to complete them whether or not they are using DigitalOcean services. And this takes us to the implications of our study. We saw that these external resources and other problems that we talked about can be artificial barriers for the reader to even start following a tutorial. For example, if they need to buy a domain, that could be a huge barrier because it even costs money for them to try to follow a tutorial. Versus tutorial authors might be able to introduce some simple interventions and alternatives by making some small changes to the host's files. So the tutorial might be able to completely eliminate the need for this resource. And we think tutorial authors should invest in providing this kind of accessible alternatives. And a related problem is template values. These template values force the reader to dig into a knowledge base to figure out what they need to plug into these commands before they can even execute them. And tutorials might be able to automatically plug in what people already have in their accounts if they are logged in. Or if the user is not logged in, the tutorial might be able to replace these template values with something that can work locally. So we observed all of these issues, for example, inconsistency in the code blocks, missing instructions, or even documentation rot. And however the tutorial authors try their best to minimize these issues, but the reality is these tutorials are written by humans, and there is always a chance that there will be errors in these tutorials. And here is the reason we think tutorial testing can be very important, but it does require some investments from tutorial authors. For example, we envision if the tutorial authors could use some annotations when they write the tutorial to specify what each of these code blocks need to do, we will be able to better execute these tutorials automatically and ensure that the tutorial is executable when the reader tries to run them. For example, using these annotations, the tutorial author might be able to specify what should be the response to a prompt or what should be the user that executes a command. I want to conclude my talk by mentioning that the tutorials might be fundamentally broken, and the readers experience this problem every day. This makes it harder for readers to follow a tutorial, and it makes it even harder for the authors to write a tutorial. So we've been working on notebooks as a new interactive way to write tutorials. This way we can ensure that tutorial can be executed. To learn more about notebooks, please check out the link on the screen. I would be happy to discuss any questions you might have in our discussion session. Thanks for watching.